So maybe we'll get started. Marshall, can you see the full screen?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. Um, all right, so for everyone who's on, we'll get started. There's more people that are registered, but we also want to honor your time and that you're on time. So they can jump in as we move on. So welcome everyone to this webinar for the NIICE, the National Inventory for Institutional Infrastructure for Community Engagement. And we appreciate you being on here. Our task here is to give you some background on the NIICE and then to answer questions that you have. So we're going to run through some slides just to kind of orient you to the instrument, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So a couple things. One is I would say mute your mic until we open it up for a conversation. And then as you have questions that come up, you can put them in the chat and we can go back to that and make sure that we cover things. So if there's something that strikes you as we're moving along, go ahead and put it in the chat and we'll come back to it. So quick introductions. I'm the person on the right. I'm John Saltmarsh. I teach at the University of Massachusetts, Boston in the higher education doctoral program. And I also direct the Carnegie classification for community engagement out of the Swear Center at Brown University. Marshall, you want to do an intro?
Sure. I'm Marshall Welch. I'm coming to you today from the Portland, Oregon area. And right now I'm an independent scholar doing a lot of work with John on the inventory and some other projects with faculty development and community engagement professionals with Lena Dostilio. So very happy to have this time with everybody today.
Great, thanks. Okay, so let's do just sort of a quick overview on the NIICE. So this is a web-based survey. So you'll go in and you'll fill this out online. It can be completed by one person or a team with administrators. There's some data that you'll probably need, we'll come back to this later, that may not be sort of readily accessible. So you may want to sort of think through getting that before you sit down and fill it out, although you can start it and then come back to it too. The data that it asks for is easily accessible. And there's a couple of things to kind of keep in mind here. And if you have questions about this, make sure you let us know. But one is that by filling out the NIICE, you actually will get your data back. And you get your data back in comparison to national peers. And again, we'll come back to that. So the other part of that is that the more campuses that fill this out, the larger the database and the larger the end, which is more reliable data in terms of doing that comparative analysis. So that's why we're encouraging as many campuses as possible to fill this out, because it's actually just good for everybody to do that. So why do the NIICE? There's a few things. One is, think about it primarily for self-study. This is to do self-assessment for your center. It's not an institutional assessment, it's a center assessment. We know from past experience that this can work really well in terms of doing program review. I actually just did a program review at a university in New England, and as the external reviewer, part of what I had the campus do was to do the NIICE, because I felt like I needed that data as part of the review process, and it was really helpful. And then it was helpful for them too, as they think about sort of how to move forward. The other thing to keep in mind is that the data that you gather around the NIICE can be fed into the Carnegie application. So if you're doing a Carnegie, either a first time or a reclassification, everything you do with the NIICE can be fed right into the Carnegie application. And then there's the strategic planning part, and we'll talk about this again later in the webinar, but there's the NIICE, and then there are institutes that we run around the NIICE, which are for campuses who fill it out and get their data, but then want to really sort of hunker down and look at that data really carefully for strategic planning purposes. And you could certainly do that on your own, But what we try to do is create a retreat setting over a couple of days where a group of campuses, we try to keep it to be a pretty small group of like 15 campuses, come together and really dig into their data. So again, we'll come back to that. And then the last part is around field building, and that goes to the part where the more campuses that participate in this, the larger the data set we have for comparative purposes, which is just good for everybody. So if you're filling this out, we really appreciate you doing that. But the more you can talk to your colleagues around the importance of filling it out, that would also help too. So we'll touch on some of these things in a minute. So what we want to do in this webinar is just a quick history and background. We'll talk about the NIICE format and functions. We'll talk more about the institutes, and then talk about sort of this new improved version of the NIICE, which is the one that you'll be accessing. But we just want to tell you sort of what we've done to try to enhance it. So quick history, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but a few years ago, Marshall and I were just trying to understand what was happening with centers for community engagement across the country, and realized there wasn't a whole lot of good data on it. There were good case studies going back to the late 1990s, but there wasn't any empirical data. And so we were trying to think through a whole bunch of different things. We were trying to figure out, like, how could we get that data? How could it help institutions advance their work? How could it feed into the Carnegie? And we responded to an RFP for a book chapter that Ari Hoy and Matthew Johnson were doing. And that was the first time we published on this. We did a survey to actually get the original data, and then we published on it. But the book chapter was a little bit limiting in terms of the space we had, and we had a lot of really good data from the first survey we created. So we expanded the writing out in an article which was in the Journal of Higher Education Outreach and Engagement. And what happened almost immediately is we started getting calls from campuses saying, can we use this article? Because this is really helpful as we try to make a case for more staffing, more resources for our center, the kind of programming we should be doing for our center. This is the only thing that we have that is giving us empirical evidence about what's happening in the field. And so of course we said, hey, absolutely use it for those purposes. And then following that, Marshall did a kind of how-to book, which expanded the article out further and really helped campuses thinking about the process for using this data, which is the book Engaging Higher Education. So when you come to an institute, we use the book as one of the key resources. So somebody sounds like they aren't on mute. So if you can figure out who that is and put yourself on mute, that ambient noise will go away. Great, thanks. All right, so the rationale and conceptual framework behind this is we know there's been an evolution of centers for community engagement going back to really their origins. They emerged in the late 1980s, and in the 1990s, they become sort of this key focus on infrastructure to support community service, and in particular, service learning. These centers start out sort of focused on curriculum and supporting faculty, community partners, students, staff, but the work becomes more and more expansive. And Mary Walshart wrote about this in the early 1990s, where she talked about enabling mechanisms. In other words, how are we going to do this work around community engagement if there isn't some enabling mechanism to help us do it? And so we want to use the findings as a resource to assist higher education institutions in assessing, developing, maintaining, expanding their center programming around community engagement. The way that we organize the original data collection, and then the organization actually seemed to work really well. So it's also the way that Marshall's book is organized, is around purposes, platforms, and programs. So purposes provide a rationale for the structure on campus. The the purposes then shape the platforms by which the center operates, both internally on campus and externally with community partners. And then there's programming. And particularly, we look at programming around students, faculty, and community partners. And then this framework helps to just organize how we think about this and then how we do the work. Well, it's actually how the instrument is organized, but also the institutes that we do. So our original methodology was to do a review of the literature. And then we took the findings from the literature to create a survey. We field tested the survey. We distributed, got the data back, did an analysis of the data. That all fed into that article I mentioned earlier. And then we converted the survey into an inventory. So an inventory so that it would be actually an assessment tool that could be used for strategic plannings. And it's not in any way meant for ranking purposes. There's not like a higher or lower on the inventory. It's really for your own use to see how what you're doing compares to what's going on in the field. I think I skipped one there. Hang on a second. Yeah, so in that review of the literature, we also looked at Carnegie applications so that we could get a sense of how the centers were emerging there. And we wanted to look at the Carnegie benchmarks. We looked at a whole bunch of different sources. Again, a lot of this was case studies. And 6 categories emerged, which then created the structure for the original survey. Institutional architecture and policy, center infrastructure, operations, and then programming in these 3 different areas, which I mentioned earlier. We looked at the Carnegie data, so from 147 campuses, again, trying to understand what was happening in terms of the data that was showing up in Carnegie. We did this work around reciprocal validity, which is something that Marshall had done before, which was in the original survey, we asked the respondents at the end of the survey to provide us with any additional best practices from their own work that wasn't showing up in the survey. And that was really helpful because we got a number of things that just weren't part of the literature, therefore didn't show up in the survey. But from the director's position on the ground was really important to how they thought about the work of their center. That fed into the revision that we'll talk about in a minute. And we presented some of this data at NIIICE in 2012, and then again, the journal article that came out in 2013. And as I said, we were kind of struck by the response that we got to the article. Always better to use data and somebody else's work when you're trying to make a case with your administration for more resources instead of just saying, well, we think we need more. And then also using it for strategic planning. So part 2 was that we revised the survey instrument into 120 items. We sent it out to Carnegie classified and non-classified campuses to their centers. And then we got data back from that, from Carnegie around 50 campuses and non-Carnegie around 36. That number actually, I think, has gone up since then. And that was the data that we were using when campuses were coming to the institutes, because we could then say, here's how your data compares to this larger data set. So we created a database that had over 175 institutions. We could use that for comparative purposes and for research. In the latest revision, which you have, we made the decision that that data was getting old and that we needed new data. And we used that opportunity also to revise the instrument. So the data that you're going to be providing is going to be compared to new institutions, not the institutions that did it before January of 2018. All right, so that's the history. I'm going to let Marshall dig into the inventory itself.
Okay, thanks. So John's going to be clicking the mouse here. So John alluded to this before, the survey or the inventory The original survey that morphed into the inventory has these parts: institutional architecture, which is really looking at structures within the institution as a whole, like flow charts, policy procedure manuals, and etc. The next piece is the center infrastructure in terms of the administration, personnel, physical space. The next one is the center operations, which is day-to-day functions, programming, budget, that sort of thing. Center programming are the events and activities for students, faculty, and community partners. And then the next section is about the center director, their background, their degree, their experience, where they came from. And then institutional information that just gives us demographics. You're going the wrong way, John.
Sorry.
There you go.
There you go.
There you
Sorry.
go. Enrollment size, number of departments, and community engagement courses. And that's the section that John alluded to earlier. You might need to consult with a registrar's office or another office unit on campus to give you that kind of information. But otherwise, the other sections can be pretty much completed and filled in by a center director and staff pretty much off the top of their head. Okay, next slide.
Yeah, and we should probably say here too, Marshall,
Yeah.
because it may be a little confusing. When we turn this into an inventory from a survey, we also were able to do it in a Likert scale that we could score. So the first 4 bullets on here, we would then score for comparative purposes. We didn't score information around the center director or your institutional information. But it's that background scoring in the online tool that allows us to do the comparative work.
Right, and we're going to visually illustrate that here in a couple of, in fact, this is a screenshot from the new version, and you see the Likert type responses here. And what those responses are weighted, so you get kind of a mean score and in a bar graph that we're going to show you here in a moment. And I just want to explain the response options here real quickly. If you mark yes, that means yes, this is happening, we're doing it, it exists. The second one is partially or in progress, meaning, well, it's not fully implemented, we're still working on it, but it's been approved, we're designing it, or we just started it. And the third one is plan to, and it's interesting that I've worked with a couple of schools now that have seen this, and they say, well, wouldn't everybody write plan to? And not necessarily. These are concrete initiatives or programs that you aspire to do eventually. But it's not, a dream. It's like, oh, in a year from now, we're hoping to have alternative break programming or something like that. And then the last one is no plan at all. And that's not punitive in any way. It may be that, oh, our office or unit simply doesn't do this work. For example, I'll go back to alternative break. That could be a program that's coming out of a different office in student life, and a Center for Community Engagement may not be doing that at all. So they simply say, no, we don't do it, and we don't plan to do it. Next slide will show how this, we accumulate these weighted indicators and compare it to, in quotes, ideal or maximum score, which is based on the Lit Review and the Carnegie criteria. And that becomes the bar, if you will, that we use to make the comparisons visually. So the next slide. This is what we're saying. You get a bar graph that shows the, quote, ideal score, which, by the way, nobody can get. It's not possible to get. It's just the total sum of all those items. And then you get your score, as well as the Carnegie institution mean scores, the Carnegie peer mean scores. So if you're a liberal arts school, you get the Carnegie mean scores from liberal arts schools. If you're an RU1, you get those scores. You also see the non-Carnegie mean scores, and you get a table summary with some crosstabs there. And we're going to show you what this looks like, right? I think the next slide. Yeah, it's sideways. So everybody tilt their head, and you can see that the blue bar is, quote, the ideal score, and that comes from the literature and the Carnegie, and then the I guess we'll call it the rust-colored bar right next to it is your score. The other bars are the peer and the Carnegie everything I just described. And what's nice is you can literally eyeball and see where you fall in compared to the blue bar. And so if you look at the top of the slide, that category is institutional architecture. And you'll see that this is the only bar, the only rust-colored bar that is falling below the other bars. So just eyeballing this graph, this institution would say, we need to take a look at the institutional architecture. Otherwise, we're doing pretty well in all these other areas. So the next slide, I think, depicts this in a table format. Yeah. And these data are from St. Mary's College of California, where I was. So we're no problem in sharing this with you here. But we never share anybody's results with anybody else. But you can see the ideal score was 25, and we were coming in at 15, which is below the Carnegie mean responses of 18.77. So just looking at that table gives us a starting point of saying, this is something that we probably want to pay attention to and do some mining and see what's happening or not happening. So the next slide, like we said, it takes about 2 hours to complete. And we'll talk about how to approach that completion process. Next slide. And as I said, you're probably able to answer about 90% of the items off the top of your head, but you may have to refer to registrar office or some other unit to get demographic information for the other part of the inventory. Okay, next slide. And this is what one participant said at our first institute. This is Lisa Georgiana from St. Francis University. It's a faith-based liberal arts school in rural Pennsylvania. She said the inventory checklist for promising practice and infrastructure of centers is a very useful tool for us to assess how we compare to other institutions. The checklist is helping us plan for the future more effectively, saving us valuable resources. And I'll tell you what they did. They identified 2 priority areas from the inventory and at the institute. And that was 2 years ago. And they are well on their way. They've met their first 2 goals, and they're now moving ahead. The first goal was they needed official definition and course designation process. And then they wanted to create a faculty advisory group to help advance this on campus. They accomplished both. And now they're working on faculty development. So they really did use the inventory results and the Institute for strategic planning. Okay, next slide. So the inventory is nice. You, no pun intended, you get the results, you get the data, you can eyeball it and see where you're doing really well, what's working for you, and see where areas you need. However, the bow on the package is going to a strategic planning institute because it gives you the gift of time, at least a day and a half, perhaps 2 days, where you just hunker down with your colleagues from your own institution, and you hear other institutions as we unpack the data, and a very rich dialogue takes place. Let's go to the next slide, John. Because we literally unpack each and every item on the inventory. And originally, when we first started doing this, I thought that was going to be too tedious, and John said, no, I don't think so. And John was right, because the participants would stop us and say, tell us more about this. What is that? And rather than John or me doing all the answers, many of the participants would engage in a rich dialogue and exchange of ideas of saying, oh, we do that, this is how we do it. And then after we unpack the inventory results, we give the gift of time for teams from institutions to do strategic planning. And that's just like I said with St. Francis University. So more institutes are in the works for the future, or we encourage you to go to a regional campus compact or to the Bonner Network, to other networks in your region to organize one just for your area. Okay, next slide. As I said, we've had institutes so far. Campus Compact has hosted a couple, and NASPA and Askew's American Democracy Project have hosted a couple of other ones. Okay. And at the institutes, we've limited the teams to 3 participants, and that is the center director or whoever coordinates community engagement on campus, their immediate administrative supervisor, and I'm going to come back to that in just a second, and then a colleague from an affiliated unit on campus. That may be student life, it could be mission and ministry, any colleague who's doing related work in this area. The reason we have the immediate administrator supervisor come is this proves to be a fantastic professional development opportunity for administrators who are coming out of their own discipline, taking on the role of administration at their institution. And at every single institute we've had, the administrators have shared during the debriefing how meaningful and useful the institute was. They would say things like, I had no idea this was a field. I had no idea this was so complicated, that so many resources were necessary. So it's really useful to have your immediate administrative supervisor there. We have a limited number of teams, like John said, typically 10 to 12 or 15 teams come. That way it promotes some intimacy and provides a chance for dialogue. And lately it's been really a nice bookend of having the NIICE Institute with the Carnegie Classification Academy. So again, if you're interested in that, you may want to seek out some of institutions in your neighborhood, in your region, and see if something like this could be organized for your area. Okay, next slide. Here's a couple of testimonials from the institutes. The NIICE is a valuable tool, and we appreciate the opportunity to reflect on our strengths and challenges. And then Becca Berkey from Northeastern University, she writes, what was perhaps the most valuable about the Institute was the opportunity to get away from the daily hustle on our campus, to spend time with one another doing purposeful, intentional, research-driven planning. It was also a chance to share our ideas with a small group of colleagues, receive feedback, as well as offer our own suggestions with their plans. Because at the end of the Institute, we have each team report out what their priorities are in the strategic planning, and then the other participants provide a friendly critique or suggestions or offer resources. So it's a really useful time together. Okay, next slide. So at the Institute, this is what you see on the screen. Now on the left, that's the original version of the NIICE. It's been slightly modified in version 2, but with the 4-point Likert scale. So the participants sit with their own data, and then John and I walk through each section of the NIICE. And so you get to participate and observe your responses in comparison to everybody else's. And that's where the rich discussion and exchange of ideas takes place as we walk through and unpack each and every item on the inventory. Okay, next slide. As we said, there's 6 sections to the inventory. And so after each section, we pause. And we tell everybody to literally hit the pause button, go back and mark one item in that section that caught your attention. And so by the end of the unpacking portion of the Institute, you've identified at least 6 priority areas based on your data from your institution. And then we ask you to identify two priority areas out of the 6. One area of strength to continue building upon, and one area that needs attention. And then these become steps for an action plan. And we help you with the action planning. So the next slide, we help folks take all this information and start thinking about the next steps to take. And it's really just a starting point. So go to the next slide. As I said, we have everybody pick at least 2 priority areas and ask them to provide a brief rationale for this targeted goal and draft an observable, measurable goal statement so you'll know if you met your goal. For example, we're going to design and implement a faculty development cohort curriculum that includes outcome measures, or we're going to launch an endowment campaign, or we're going to increase staff to 6 by the end of the academic year. And then the action plan comes up with all the steps that will take you to meet that goal. So the next slide. The action plan has a worksheet, and the very first question we ask, is there institutional mission alignment? And that's a good starting point because that becomes sort of the cornerstone of the foundation that you're going to be building from. You want to align this work with your institutional mission. So we give you an opportunity to do that. We also ask, is community engagement in the strategic planning of your institution? If so, be sure to include that as part of the rationale. And then we give you time to think about how you're going to capture or articulate the essence of community engagement within the context of your institutional mission and your strategic planning. Okay, so this is what it looks like. This is an actual goal that came out of, I think, of the first half-day institute that we did. This institution identified a lack of community engagement courses and qualified faculty to teach them. And so they want to increase community engagement courses because it's tied to the campus strategic plan and accreditation review. So we talk about at the Institute how to make an observable and measurable goal statement. And here's what they came up with. To develop and implement a semester-long faculty development learning community for 6 to 10 instructors consisting of 3 half-day retreats to develop a course proposal or syllabus for a new service learning course using Sarah Axtell's faculty development model from the University of Minnesota to be incorporated into the new curriculum for next academic year. That shows what the action is, the condition, the setting, the duration, and a criteria. So they'll know whether they actually accomplished this at the end of the timeline. So then we have folks sit down and brainstorm all the possible and foreseeable steps that it's going to take to get to that goal, and we have them list the chronology of those steps. So on the next slide, you can see these are all the things that that institution decided they had to do, and then they ordered them. So the first thing they did was identify and obtain $500 per participant honorarium. Second was review the calendar for half-day retreats and so on. So these became the steps and actual rows in an action plan that we're going to see here on the next slide. And so there's the goal up at the top, and then a plan of who does what, with what, when, and an outcome date. And each row continues on based on those things that we just saw on the previous slide. So here's a picture of some participants at an institute that ADP and ASCU and NASPA did in Baltimore last June. Here's 2 colleagues hard at work in the afternoon. And I love this picture of the action plan. As you can see, it's a tool. It's a tool where they can come back on a monthly basis to see where they are. And I love the arrows and the scribbling and the brainstorming right there on that item there that they're working on, that instrument, okay? So that's a brief overview of what the inventory looks like and how the institutes are organized to take those results for strategic planning. John's going to talk about the next steps and how we've improved the NIICE, and then entertain and address questions that folks typically ask. So John, you can take over here.
Okay, great. All right, so with this new version, which again is the version that you're going to be using, it was launched in January. We got input and feedback from the different institutes that we did, where campuses would say, well, you know, what about this item or this particular kind of programming? That seems like it's really critical. So we made sure that we took notes of those things. We revised it. We also improved the response options and the results. For instance, what Marcela said before, maybe a particular item just isn't applicable to your campus for good reasons. And so we didn't want to have that as be part of the scoring. So there's approximately 150 items at this point. The instrument itself in its online version has been streamed down with pull down menus, which should just make it easier to fill out. It does still take about 2 hours to complete it from beginning to end. And then the other part is that Campus Compact has replaced the annual survey this coming year with the NIICE. So in other words, what the Compact is saying to their members is, for this coming year, they're not doing the annual survey, but they recommend that campuses do the NIICE. And what that will mean is that the Compact will get the aggregate data from us at Brown University, where the NIICE lives, and be able to do a report at the end of the year based on its members' responses. So again, coming back to what I said earlier, the more campuses, and in this case, Campus Compact members that do the NIICE, the better the overall data and the better the report that the Compact will be able to do at the end of the year. So here's the Compact website. This is what it looks like, explaining how they're using it for the coming year. This hasn't been worked out entirely, but I think that what will happen is that the Compact will use this on a periodic basis, like every 3 to 5 years. And then we'll have some trend data that we can begin to look at too. And then in the other years, they'll be using a revised version of their survey. And again, I just want to emphasize that if you do this, Compact member or not a Compact member, you will get your individual institutional data back in those forms that, or something similar to those forms that you saw earlier with the bar graph and the chart, so that you can see how your data compares with Carnegie peers and other peers. Yeah, we've touched on all of this earlier. Again, this can feed into your Carnegie classification. So, okay, so now what? There are more institutes in the work, and Marshall, remind me, are you doing one at ADP this year?
I think that's still being worked out. So it's tentatively planned.
Okay, but I would just check the Swear Center website periodically. I don't think at this point have nailed down any, but our plan is to start running them again in the fall. And part of that is that we don't want to start doing the institutes until we have the comparative data to work with. So campuses now are filling it out. Over the summer, we can begin to look at comparisons. If you fill it out in the spring, you'll get your report back in the fall based on that comparative data. And at that point, we can start running institutes. So just look for that. That'll be coming. And we'll just do these on a regular basis, fall, probably winter, spring, into next summer. So just, again, check the Swear Center website. Yeah, so again, there's opportunities for further research here. There's opportunities for the Campus Compact to be able to get its data. I know there are a lot of Bonner schools on this call, and it's certainly possible for the Bonner Foundation to get aggregate data from its members to be able to do a report at the end of this as well. and to be able to do some research around the Bonner campuses and analyze the data. Okay, so the nitty-gritty in terms of where we are now, we're really encouraging campuses to do this by May 1. What we're trying to do is create incentives to get as large a database as possible for comparative purposes. And then after May 1, we'll be shifting to a sliding scale based on FTE. So you can see what that looks like here, which is considerably more than the 150 that it will cost you to do it before May 1. So again, we encourage you to do it now, and would also encourage you to reach out to your colleagues to get them to do it, because the more campuses, the better for everybody. And then information about the NIICE is at the Brown website at the Swear Center. So if you go there, this is what you'll see. And if you click on where the arrow is, that'll get you to the instrument. So that's kind of where we are now. And I think what we can do is open this up. Let's just, these slides we can make available to you, but let's, I think, open it up for some discussion at this point. Let me get out of this. Okay, so I'm going to stop that. We have one question in the chat. So it says, I attended the IEPUI Carnegie Academy. Okay, sorry, that was to me privately. I'll come back to that one. So let's, if you want to unmute yourself, there aren't any other questions for everybody. If you have questions, we'd be happy to think them through with you.
I know one question that typically comes up, or two questions typically come up. So we'll just address them here. One is, well, who should fill this out? The person who has their pulse on the campus in terms of community engagement. So that could be a center director. It could be someone who coordinates these efforts on campus. It could be a team or a staff. And in that way, it becomes sort of an exercise for staff to do some self-assessment and reflection. So it really, it doesn't matter, whoever's the most knowledgeable, but if you think it's going to benefit your staff or a group of administrators to do it collectively, we encourage you to do that. The second question that typically comes up is, what if we have more than one center? And so there's kind of a two-part answer to that. If you have more than one center on your campus doing this type of work, we encourage all the centers to do it individually. And ideally, you would complete them together, because that gives you an opportunity to have some cross-conversation, to see what they're doing, what you're doing, and you can begin to make some comparisons on things. And then that's thrown into the aggregate database, and you get all those responses back. But I think what we've discovered is when that happens, the centers discover things about each other that they didn't know about, or that one center may be doing something that is considered to be community engagement, according to the definition of the Carnegie classification, that may or may not be community engagement, and it's more of a traditional outreach kind of thing. And that becomes a good vehicle for dialogue and conversation as well. So those are two questions that typically come up.
So Marshall, yeah, here I'm going to just read these and let you field these. Okay, so one is, we're right on the edge of launching an institutional office of engagement and outreach, and would it make sense for us to complete this now based on everything we have in place for the office, or wait until it's been around for a year or so?
Wow, that's a really good question. I see pros and cons. If you did it now, it would give you sort of a baseline, and it might help you determine where you want and need to go. Conversely, if you waited, it's really doing more of self-assessment at the time. So, so I'm not sure. I think if my inclination is just mine is you may want to do it now to get some baseline to help you plan for future directions of your center. But I don't think there's a hard and fast best answer to that. I think that's something for you to all consider. But my initial response would be to do it now and get some baseline, and that may help you plan in the implementation of your launch.
Okay. Another one, Marshall, it says, I work at the University of Mississippi. We're very curious to know more about our peer institutions, public, very high research. What's the N for our peer group within the NIICE data set?
Well, as I said, as John and I've said, we're launching the new versions. So the N is small right now. As far as I know, there's only been about 50 institutions that have completed the second version of the NIICE. But in terms of the first version, one of the pie charts and graphs that comes out shows the comparison of the other institutions, of Research One institutions. So version 1 does show the comparison of other institutions, and that's useful for you to go to your administration and say, well, here's what other RU1s are doing, what they have or don't have. But right now we don't know what the N is because we're launching. And the idea is to build the new database over the course of spring and summer so we can distribute the aggregate data in mid to late fall. So we can't tell you right now. That's because we don't know.
Yeah, we just don't know. And this is one of those ones where encourage your peers to fill it out, and then we can give you better data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we know how useful that is to have comparative data. So like when I was at St. Mary's College, and anytime there was a new initiative, my administration would always want to know, well, what's Santa Clara doing? You know, so we know that that's useful data. So the more institutions that fill this out, the better we have, the better comparative data we have.
All right, that's it in the chat, unless someone wants to jump in here. So hang on, here's a new one. Do you have any particular goal for how many institutions you hope to participate this summer, this spring, summer, or the longer term? Well, what we were aiming for was 450 campuses. We figured if we had that as a data set, we'd actually be able to provide campuses with pretty reliable comparative data. So that's what we're aiming for.
Hey, John?
Yeah.
This is Rick Ellis from Washburn. I have two questions. One is, I'm not clear, where do I go to actually sign up and get the survey so I can actually do it like tomorrow? I mean, I want to do it quickly.
Go to the Swear Center for Public Service site at Brown University. And
was that link you showed on there, that NC2 link will get me
yep.
to the application process to pay you the $150?
Yep.
Right. So when you go into that application, there'll be a way for you to register and then pay the fee and fill it out.
Okay. Second question. How early in the fall might we get our feedback, since we're looking at doing the Carnegie application? And I know that that's due like in April of 19. So will we have it early enough to not have to really go back a lot in the work we've done?
Yeah, that's a good question too. And we don't have a firm date on that, but because we know campuses want to use it for the Carnegie, I'm thinking that we'll do the reports over the summer and try to get these out to campuses in September and October.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You bet.
And let me speak to that real quick. Even if we had a small comparative data early on, you still have your data that you can compare to the benchmarks from the literature and from Carnegie. So I know that I've been to 2 Bonner campuses recently, and they realize there's no large comparative data, but we still walked through their responses because it still gives you indicators of what's going well. We're really strong in this area, and oh, here's some things that we need to be thinking about. So for strategic planning purposes, the data is still useful.
This is Joe Blosser from High Point University. I just had a question. If I'm looking at doing this immediately before May 1st. So if that initial cohort maybe is small, say a year from now you've had 400 more campuses, is there a way that we could, get a comparison data a year out or something when there are more people to compare us to?
Yeah, so I think what you're asking is, say, in the fall of 2019, you are doing some planning and you want fresh data, right? You can come back to us and ask for another report, and we'll run it based on the N at that time, which hopefully will be larger. We're hoping that campuses continue to participate in this, and as that happens, the data set continues to get larger. If you come to an institute, a year and a half from now, we'll be using the fresh data for that. So yeah, you can just come back to us and ask for another report.
And the other thing that I'll add to that is the tentative plan and thinking is that the data sets will live as a cohort for, I think, 4 years, and then we start over. That way you have 4 years of an entering class to go through. And then we start the process over in 4 years. That's the tentative discussion.
Okay. And I think you just answered Rebecca's question. So Rebecca, if that didn't answer your question, let us know. So here's one, which is also a good question. It says, if we do this now, but maybe the office doesn't officially launch until July 1, would we list things as yes, partially, or plan to? For example, we don't technically have an institutional budget today, but we will on July 1.
Yeah, I think that would make sense, the plan to, or that other option that's partially. I mean, you're in the process of doing it. When it comes to the plan to, it's just not this huge wish list and you hit everything. I mean, you need to realistically say, yeah, that's something we really plan on doing 2 years from now, something like that.
Yeah, so this gets defined in the inventory.
Yeah.
But partial is you're actually starting to do it. And plan to is you haven't done anything, but it's in your plan. You're aspiring to do this, but you actually haven't put anything into place yet, right? So just try to think about, like, is this something that we've actually implemented, or we're just thinking this would be a good thing to implement? And I think given what you're describing here, these things are not just things that you're hoping will happen someday, but you've got concrete plans that are going to go into place in July 1. So I would answer it partially. Right? And for anyone on here, if you have questions like that as you're filling it out and you'd like some help trying to figure out sort of how to approach it, drop us an email. We'd be happy to help you, and we can get on a call and talk things through. One of the things that we often get asked about is multiple centers, right? And it's often not clear who fills this out, so we can help you sort of sort that out. All right, so here's a clarification, Marshall. Do you expect some institutions may want to update their data more frequently than every 4 years? If yes, would that just replace their previous data in the database?
Yeah, I would think so. I would think, yeah, it would.
Okay. All right. That's everything in the chat. Anybody else want to jump in here? Okay. So again, thank you all for participating. We hope you all we'll fill it out. And then again, as I said multiple times, this is good for everybody, the more campuses that do it. If you have questions while you're doing it, Marshall and I are available. You can email us. If we need to get on a call, we can do that. The primary place you want to go to for any information on the NIICE is at the Swear Center of Brown. So I guess if there aren't any other questions, we'll bring this webinar to a close. Anything else, Marshall?
No, that's it. Thanks for your interest and your questions, and we hope you'll participate in this project.
Okay, great. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.